And we're live. And we're live. Thank you everyone for joining me today. Having some technical difficulties, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to get into the comments and view them as we're going through this interview, which is a little bit of a departure from interviews I've typically done. I'm sorry, having some tech issues on my end that I was not prepared for. But all that aside, thank you for being out today. And thank you to my guest, Christopher Caldwell-Kelly, who's joining me for the interview. I'm going to read from your bio real quick, and then we can get started from there if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Hello.
So Christopher Caldwell-Kelly is a queer Black American living in Glasgow, Scotland, with his partner, podcaster Alice Caldwell-Kelly. He's the 2007 recipient of the Octavia E. Butler Memorial Scholarship to Clarion West. His work has appeared in Faya, Strange Horizons, Uncanny Magazine, and the New Sons 2 anthology, among others. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the bio before we get started?
Really, I should actually have a web page up so that people can find it. But that is that is coming soon. So next time I'll actually just have a place to direct people to all of my stuff. But yeah, that's a pretty good sampling of my work if people aren't familiar with me and want to look at it. In particular, I've sold 5 stories to Uncanny Magazine. So if you look under my name, which is published under Christopher Caldwell there, then you can find any of those 5 stories.
Cool. And whenever your website gets up, I will try to update the description box to have it linked there. So people who are catching the replay can find it. So what got you started writing?
For me, it was pretty much a natural outgrowth of all the games that kids play. So everybody grows up playing Let's Pretend, Make Believe. I'm Superman. I'm my own made-up superhero. And for me, I just never stopped that. So I don't know, probably around 7 or 8, I started writing things down and putting them into little notebooks and making little booklets. And I never stopped doing that. I just kind of kept at it, and I continued writing short fiction and slightly longer fiction and some really terrible things through junior high, high school, university years. I spent quite a few years writing what people refer to as serious literary fiction. And actually, I think I found that I had more fun moving back to speculative fiction, that there is a bit of flexibility there that I wasn't really allowed to pursue in the kind of stuff I was writing elsewhere.
That's really interesting. So I feel like there's something about your style that can still be very literary, so I can like see how you started there. But yeah, I don't really know very many authors who I guess jump genres around like that, or
well,
to me.
I mean, if I'm really honest, I'll tell you that I think that genre for the most part is just different clothes on some of the same stuff. So like I've been typed as horror, I've been typed as magic realism, I've been typed as a couple of other things, and if you ask me, I will say that I think I am a fantasist, but I can see how if you read those other genres, you can see the influences in the way that I write and the way that I work, and kind of go, well, maybe he's this, maybe he's this type of thing. And I think what it comes down to is that telling stories is pretty human. So there aren't as many ways to tell stories as we like to think they are, and a lot of the boundaries between the different genres are really more about marketing and less about what the content is.
Do you mind defining what a fantasist is? Like, is that different from being a fantasy writer?
It's the same thing.
Okay.
Just me trying to trim down the word.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So in your bio, it said you are currently living in Scotland, and I was wondering if, like, moving there inspired any changes in like how you wrote or what you like to write about?
I honestly, one of the big changes in moving here is my partner Alice has actually been an enormous help and influence and good editor and really pushing me to get my work out there. Written tons of stuff that just I kind of sat on and didn't submit, or I'd submit once, twice, and like you know all the conventional wisdom is you have to submit how many hundreds of times before you get published. And
Yeah.
basically, I would just get, "Oh, that's a rejection. It's no good," which is not the best thing to do if you're going for any type of publication. And Alice was really good at pushing me to, "You're being too much of a perfectionist. Submit it again. Submit it again," and worked. um, Also, it allows me to living here, and I've lived here for gosh, 11 years next month. It allows me to view the United States from kind of a misty watercolored lens
Mhm.
because I don't live there anymore. So when I write about the US or a US like country, which sometimes I do, um, I'm allowed to take more liberties with it is as it is, and it's more colored by memory. And for me, that's helpful because if I'm making up a story about something, but I have all of the things to observe about it right around me, then I will try to put those things in first. And I rely too much on trying to provoke verisimilitude rather than trying to provoke the emotion that I want to go with.
Mhm.
So that's the reason I don't write very much about Scotland is because I live here. So maybe next time I go on a long holiday, I'll write my very first Glaswegian set story. I don't know.
Yeah, that's funny. I guess it's just always interesting to me because I feel like there's something for writers about like leaving the United States and like how that's changed their art. At least I'm thinking about like, France and
Right.
like James Baldwin and stuff like that. And so I'm always curious when like authors leave the United States, like if that's like freeing, if it's like feels like distant, like how that changes what they write about.
I mean, not to be kind of depressor about my home country, but depressor, that's not a word. Downer. It is freeing in a way. There are a lot of things that you deal with in the United States on a daily level that are difficult and smothering. And while you're there, you don't notice them. It's the- kind of like the old aphorism about a frog in boiling water doesn't hop out of the pot because the temperature is always cranked up. Um, and there are plenty of things that are not good here. There are plenty of things that are difficult. Racism doesn't go away wherever you are, but the ways of dealing with it are differently.
Mm.
So I think that, yeah, being freed from that particular environment and going to a different one does kind of change your perspective on it at the very least.
Got it. So was there anything else you want to share about, I guess, just like background about you? I was gonna start asking more specific questions about your writing.
Um, I don't know. The only thing is that viewers listening to this may think that they are weird or queer or strange or not very mainstream, and I do want to say that that's not really a problem. I'm all of those things, um, and sometimes those things that kind of make you feel isolated or set apart from people really are something that can make your writing shine. And sometimes when you're trying to publish, you need to stand out just a little bit from everybody else for people to even notice you because there's so many people who are very good, competent, talented writers, and there's only so many space in the publication trades. So I would say that don't worry about trying to sand off all the rough edges first.
Thank you for sharing that. So, this is kind of like a dual question,
Mhm.
about an island in its splendor and didn't my Lord deliver Daniel?
Okay.
Um, So magical clothes play an important role in both of those stories, and I was wondering, like, what are the storytelling possibilities of clothes? Because I hadn't seen very many magical clothes used in this way before.
Okay. Um, so clothing is always kind of a big recurring thing and like a motif in my work because it's one of the first things that people see about you. Like people see your race, they'll see what they think your gender is, they'll see your hairstyles, and they see your clothes. Um, so very often I use clothing to tell the world about my characters, tell the world how they see themselves, and it's a really easy kind of um, it's like word I'm looking for. Uh, Continuation to kind of go from, well, this tells me about character A to this is a magical thing that character A can use to present themselves differently. And both of those examples you used, um, where Eden's power kind of comes from, uh, for lack of a better word, her disguise, but really her persona. And The other one where Eric is clothing himself in the sea to kind of become someone different are about the power of clothing to kind of transform, to change, to move perceptions. Um, Eric in particular is a character who is in another story. Actually, he's in two other stories. But One of my very first published stories was called Serving Fish, which is a kind of odd um, 6,000 word short story about a drag queen who rescues a magical fish when he's a young boy. And Obviously, that's obsessed with clothing because the art of drag is the art of clothes, it's the art of dressing up. Um, so, in particular, everything that has Eric in it has to do with appearances, clothing, um, the changing of forms. He appears very briefly in Deep Like the Rivers, which is in. I'm gonna have to just Trouble the Waters. Look at the book. Um, Tales from the Deep Blue, which came out last year, and that's about a young boy who wants to be a mermaid, and also is about kind of changing shape and changing form. And clothing is the quickest and easiest way we have to kind of change shape and change form. So, as somebody who is kind of concerned with things like how we present ourselves to the world and how we present ourselves to ourselves, how we present ourselves to our friends, those are all things that people do. Clothing is a natural outgrowth of it. And as somebody who is interested in the ways that magic informs both human belief and also um, kind of folkloric. Um, Sorry, I'm having trouble with words today. But like kind of folkloric trappings. I think that clothing is an easy and interesting way to start, and I feel like it's been underexamined. So I spend a lot of time examining how it can present itself in different ways. Oh, another thing is I just thought of is Fim and Sundance. The characters one wear fancy clothes to rob a bank, and they also use magical masks, which kind of obscure their presence from other people. So that's another thing where clothing kind of plays a heavy part.
Oh, sorry, where is Serving Fish published? Is that in an
Uh,
anthology or is that online?
Serving Fish was originally online. It is in a couple of anthologies. I have a stack of books here, so
Okay. Because I
let me
was
make
gonna
sure.
make a list of the stories that you mentioned in the description box for people to find them later. And I know
Okay.
where Fem and Sundance is, but I hadn't heard of Serving Fish before.
Um, So it was reprinted in Wild Stories 2018, which I think is probably still in print. That's this. And it was originally printed in Fantastic Stories of the Imagination People of Color Take Over. That's edited by Nisi Shaw. Um, and that is an illustration of Eric that was done by Victor Nye, who is one of my favorite artists ever.
That's so cool. So your story was picked as the one for the cover for the whole anthology.
Well, it ended up being the cover for the magazine, so it was
For
really cool.
magazine, sorry.
Yeah,
No, that's exciting. Does that happen a lot for you with your stories?
not
Or
a
is that like
lot,
the first one?
but you mentioned An Island in Its Splendor. That was also another illustration of Eric for there was a kind of omnibus of the first year of Baffling Stories, and there was an illustration of Eric that appeared on that.
Oh, nice. I I might have guessed that that was the illustration on that cover, but I don't think I was 100% sure. It's been a little bit since I've read the anthology.
Yeah,
Um,
and I also think that I don't know if it explicitly says this is Eric, but yeah, that was Eric.
yeah. But in terms of you saying that clothes are kind of underexplored in fantasy, I think that's what made these stories stand out so much to me. Um, where it's kind of like frustrating, where I'm like, this is like so unique. Um, but also like I feel like I'm under equipped to talk about it because I don't see it as much
Yeah.
as a magical device. So no, I really enjoyed that. And I was wondering, do you think fantasy writing provides opportunities for discussing gender and clothing um, that maybe we don't see in other genres or not necessarily?
So that's a I mean, my gut feeling is yes, 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 but I think that's more complicated than that. Like,
Mhm.
there's plenty of things that are in what's billed as literary fiction, serious fiction that do excellent explorations of both gender and sexuality. Um, but I do think that there is a lot of room in fantasy to discuss things um, in a more visceral way than I think is
Mhm.
often allowed in the conventions of literary fiction. There are because you have to do a grounding, if not in the real world, or because some of my things take place in secondary worlds. Um, but because you have to write a grounding that feels real to readers, like the more ridiculous the thing you're going to tell in a story, the more real other things have to be.
Mhm.
Um, when you talk about human sexuality and stuff, I think you're allowed to be, for lack of a better word, earthier and more, you know, about the actual touch, eyes, feels, smells than you necessarily would in a story that takes all of that for granted.
Mhm.
Does that make any sense? Or
Kind of, sort of.
okay, so
I think I just
what
need
I'm
to think about it some more.
so what I mean is that um for me, when I write a fantasy story, I want the reader to be able to like understand the world and feel the world without, having to read a glossary of terms or
Mhm.
uh like having to open up the front and go to a map. I like maps in books, but I don't want them to have to do that.
Mhm.
So I want to make my details very tactile and real. And I think a lot of times in uh, what stuff is billed as literary fiction, and I'm not talking about romance because romance really likes the tactile details because that's part of the experience. But we'll say some of the stuff I was writing before, a lot of that is really done sketch-wise because the reader already kind of knows what it's like to, go to a 9 to 5 boring job. The reader already knows all of these things, so because you can take that for granted, you don't really need to explore that in as much depth in the regular writer, which means that I sometimes feel it gets glossed over.
Mhm.
It is sometimes like, I remember talking about a scene in a novel I read. I can't remember what novel it is, but it was definitely a lit fiction one, and it was a sex scene. And someone said, "That was a sex scene?" I'm like, "Yeah." And the thing is because it was so kind of gently put into the story, there's a couple of lines, it's really easy to skip over it and miss it. And I think because in fantasy you're dealing with both the fantastical and sometimes ridiculous, sometimes nonsensical, um, intruding into either worlds like ours or worlds that are relatable to ours, the grounding details you put in have to be a little bit stronger. So for me, it is easier to explore things that are, well, part of what makes us human in ways that I feel have a bigger punch than they would if I were just sticking to traditional lit fiction.
Got it. And I was wondering, in terms of writing about clothing, are there any details that you particularly like to describe or that are like particularly difficult to describe?
Um, One thing I wish I were better at describing is I really like textures and colors and
Mhm.
the way they fit together. And yeah, I mean, you can't really write a whole story as a fashion monologue. Like, it's boring. So there's a lot of details that just get ripped out. That in revision, I'm like, all right, I've already said this hat is red. I don't need to describe the particular texture of it. I don't need to describe what checks it has. I don't like. Here's the fabric. If people want to know what that fabric is and they don't know, they can find out. That's enough. So I find myself pulling back from it. I find
Mm.
myself from talking less about like I don't know, like the sweater I have is kind of textured, for instance. And an early draft of this, I would probably talk about the different textures and how the design on it's by Oscar Marine, and a later draft would cut that down to it being
Yeah,
bright and maybe mentioning the artist rather than all of the extra little things in it. Um,
yeah. No, I get that. I do like textile. I crochet, and so there's like just a way that I'm like really in tune with like the texture of yarn, the color, and like how glossy it is in the feel and stuff like that. Where it's like there's no point in talking about it to people who don't work with yarn because
right.
it's like, eh. Okay, so I was gonna ask specifically about didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? I'm gonna give a quick synopsis for people who haven't read it before. I guess just like the premise. But basically, this is in a secondary world. There's a character, Elijah, who has this magical female persona, Eden, that he uses to basically care for like a group of children because this is a very dangerous world. There are like bandits, there's like these large magical beasts, and he uses this persona to transport kids to safety. And it's very important to him that people just think of him as Eden, like the kids that he's working with.
Hmm.
It's kind of like a Superman, like Santa type thing, like a superhero Santa almost. And I was wondering, like, what do you think is the importance or power of like this type of belief? Um,
Okay.
Either a
Um,
hero or like a Santa or things of that nature.
Honestly, sometimes I think about it in community leaders a lot. For instance, like let's talk about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, somebody
Mhm.
who like uh, most people who are of color have a grandmother or an aunt who has a big picture of them in the house, and if you go to my grandmother's church, she's on the back of the little fans that you use to cool yourself off, and he was without doubt a great person. He was without doubt a really intelligent, interesting person. His philosophies are good, and his worldview was kind, but he was a person. So when things are uncovered about his life that are less savory, it causes kind of this cognitive dissonance. How could this great, amazing person also, cheat on his wife, who also was a great, amazing, dignified person? Um, and I think what I wanted to kind of explore was that for these people, didn't my Lord deliver Daniel's kind of set in a sort of post-apocalyptic world? I don't ever say what the cataclysm is as that happens, but the world was pretty much like our world, and there is some kind of horrific magical disaster which has changed it beyond recognition. And there's just a small group of queer people kind of pulled together to survive. And for them, Eden is their caretaker. Eden is the person who keeps them safe. Eden is the person who, um, kind of a Moses figure, who will lead them to the promised land. And it's particularly important for Eden as Eden to remain that, whereas Elijah is selfish, kind of vain. Uh, Elijah was a bad romantic partner, which the narrator of the story points out. The narrator is Elijah's ex. Um, and in order to keep those people who have this belief in this one person who, can lead them and to help them, um, Elijah's forced to wear this mask as Eden. Um, and I think it is important to people sometimes to have somebody that they feel is, you know, above reproach. Um, and those people never are above reproach because they're people. So there is, for me, this real dichotomy between, having this great leader, this person who is, tasked with helping people, who's the person that they believe in, and the very real problems of being a person. And that's the thing I wanted to explore in that story. So that's why, in particular, um, there is that kind of. I think you earlier said Santa Claus type thing, and yeah, sort of. It is in some ways childish, but I think as adults you stay childish, and you want to have something that is pure and good that you believe in. And I think in the world where there weren't a lot of good things to believe in, it was full of despair and horrors. Having somebody who seemed pure and above reproach was an important coping mechanism for those people that Eden was taking care of.
Mm.
Does that answer the question?
Yes.
I I kind of feel like I went on a couple tangents. Sorry.
No, I think that answered the question. Do you think it's different for, I guess, adults having this type of belief versus for kids? I guess in the story they're more like teenagers.
Yeah, the teens, young adults. And I do think it's different. I don't think it's something you necessarily grow out of. Um,
Mm,
I mean, I'll be honest. I remember a certain presidential election where I was kind of really into a candidate I won't mention. Um, and I was a young adult, and I really wanted to believe that this person was going to, fix everything. Um, and it is a hard feeling when you realize that no, this person is just a person. They're a smart person, a kind person, um, or you know, a talented person, but they're not really going to save you. Um, and it is a hard disillusionment, and I feel like it's something that happens throughout your life. Obviously, it starts off early when you're a kid and you learn that Santa is not actually going to come down the tree and bring you presents, but it is kind of a constant learning thing. And I don't think it's something that you just, I mean, I think of my grandparents who, I have one living grandparent now who's 90. Um, and she and I chat a lot. She likes to text, which is really strange. But sometimes if you talk to her about politics, and she's seen lots of things. She grew up in Jim Crow. She was there for desegregation, and I think still sometimes she will pin her hopes that this person will fix stuff. And I guess I don't know. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that hope is important, and I think you can't really push for change without clinging on to hope. I just
mhm,
think that it sometimes the way we humans relate is that we like this person. This person is the one hope, and it may not be healthy, but I think it is a thing that recurs.
Mm. So a little bit of a pivot. Um, or actually, let's stay on target. So I'm not very Christian. I'm actually an atheist, but when I was like kind of typing in the name of some of your story titles into Google to like find the links or read portions of them, a lot of times I was getting like Bible verses for instance. I was like, oh,
Mhm.
this is a reference to something. Um, and I was wondering if there was a reason why that happened for you. Is it like process of coming up with titles fun for you, or is it challenging?
There's a couple of reasons. One, I was a really, really, really devout teenager. I'm not devout anymore. But I was really religious. I did a lot of Bible reading. I did a lot of Bible study. I learned some kind of basic Latin so I could read translations and I could read what people said. Uh, I didn't learn Aramaic. I didn't go that far, but like I was able to read like Saint Jerome's Vulgate, and other translations, and be like, "Oh, this is different to that." Um, so it is a recurring thing because it's just a thing that I ended up knowing a lot about. The other thing is that I'm absolutely dreadful at coming up with titles. So a lot of times the story is, all right, I'm gonna embarrass myself by going to my file and I'm gonna pull up some old names. Uh, like for instance, uh, Canst Thou Draw Out the Leviathan? The working title for that was Whale Story. Um, the working title for um, I'm trying to think of specifically ones that have kind of Did My Lord Deliver Daniel was just Eden's story. Um, and a lot of times it is just a thing that I pick that has, a connection to what I'm writing first. I don't come
Mhm.
up with the title ever until last. Um, and a lot of times I'm thinking of stuff, and like a title's not going to make or break your story. I don't think there are very many people who reject on the basis of title alone. So sometimes I look for something. You can't use a song lyric um, because of copyright problems.
Mhm.
So I kind of look for something that has a theme in the story. Sometimes I will find a line later in the story and use that. An example of that is the title for Femme and Sundance comes from a joke that they make in Femme and Sundance. Um, but sometimes if there is a kind of resonant biblical theme through the story, whether or not it's a religious story, Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel is clearly a religious story because it's about faith. But
Mhm.
Canst Thou Draw Out the Leviathan? Um, that's used kind of ironically. It's from the book of Job. Um, and what happens is that Job is kind of not really, but sort of saying, I'm really suffering a lot. All these things have happened. Why does this happen to me? And essentially, God shows up and says, who are you to question what I'm doing? I'm God. Can you do this? Can you do that? One of the things is he asks him, can you pull a leviathan, a big fish, the like sea monster, out of the ocean with a hook? And of course, Job can't. But when you're writing a whaling story, that is literally a thing they are doing. Kind of is. I mean, it's mini hooks, but they are pulling a big, giant, enormous sea creature out of the ocean. So that's used ironically. And Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel? The title is from a gospel song, and um, I do like gospel music. And because it's a story about faith, one of the big things about Daniel is Daniel's enduring faith through, well, hard times. Like Daniel's thrown into the lion's den, and these characters are thrown into a metaphorical lion's den. So it is about continuing to have faith when things are really dark and kind of terrifying. Um, let's see. I'm gonna have to remind myself of other titles. Not biblical, not biblical. I'm sure I have another one. But yeah, sometimes when I'm looking up things for a title, I'll think of a theme that happens before. Everybody uses Shakespeare, so I'm not going to Shakespeare. I'm not
Mhm.
going to be um one thing I have as a recurring motif is a lot of oceanic things, but I'm not going to go to the Tempest and pull a line from that because there are 4,000 things that are titled after the Tempest. You can't title a story "Those are pearls that were his eyes" because I'm sure there's probably 4,000 stories titled that.
Mhm.
But uh, the Bible, despite being really common and incredibly referenced a lot, is underutilized as far as story titles. So sometimes allowed to pick from things from there when I'm thinking up, does this fit the story? Does this fit the story? And yeah, um, that's that's why I end up using things like that. It's not really so much an expression of my personal faith as kind of me getting around my limitations and also using a thing that I know to facilitate some place where I'm weak.
Thanks for sharing. That's really interesting. I don't think I would have guessed that at all. So you mentioned briefly that you do like to talk about the ocean in your work, and I was wondering what like draws you to writing about the sea.
Um, so I was kind of an Air Force brat when I grew up, but if there's any single place that I lived the longest, it was Los Angeles, California, which obviously has a very big watery coastline. When I was 12, I was really into bodyboarding, which is like a precursor to surfing. Um, I always loved going to aquaria. Um, uh, when I was a small child, they used to have these things that were animal cards, which were you would see them advertised on TV, but it was kind of a like about this big uh, photographic card with different animals from the world on it. And the thing that I loved the most were the aquatic animals. So I would just read and memorize all the facts about like blue whales can grow up to 110 feet. They often weigh over 100 tons, uh, different things like that. And I would just kind of absorb all of that information. So I've always kind of felt, I don't want to say connected because that sounds more mystical than I mean it, but like I've always loved the ocean. Uh, if I spend too long away from a coast, I spent a couple of years in Colorado, which is landlocked and mountainous, and I would feel actually depressed when I didn't see the ocean for a while. It was felt like I
Mhm.
was missing an old friend. So I think it is a recurring thing, in pretty much the way I think about things is to include the ocean. And I know a lot of people are afraid of it, and it's pretty common to have a fear of it, but like it's always just seemed kind of comforting to me. Um, Actually, one of the reasons I wrote Fem and Sundance was because I had written the spate of kind of ocean themed stories, and I wanted to challenge myself to write a story that the ocean didn't really play any part in. So um, I was joking about it being like Dirt World.
That was the story title.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the ocean. I'm one of the people who's like very afraid of the ocean, but I also like the ocean. Like,
Uh-huh.
I would not go to the beach if there's no lifeguard. I would not go out past my waist. Like, I can swim, but I'm not trying to test it.
Right. I mean, I've had some. I used to go swimming at night, which probably isn't the best idea.
Yeah, that sounds scary.
And sometimes alone. And there's a time that I got caught in a riptide, and I was like, "Oh, I could be swept out, and no one would ever find me." And it was scary, but it didn't stop me from going back to the ocean. Like, you would think that I'd be like, "Oh, okay, you're lucky, stay away," and no.
Yeah. No. I still love ocean documentaries. There's so much weird stuff at the bottom of the sea.
Yeah, there really
Um,
is.
do you have a favorite ocean animal?
Um, it's hard to pick. If you asked me when I was 6 years old, it would be the blue whale. That was my favorite ocean animal because they were so big and so, like, kind of graceful, and they
Hmm.
make those sounds that nobody else does. I've recently gotten more fond of, the sperm whales because 'cause they're actually really cool, and, uh, we're learning more about their family structures.
Hmm.
Um, this'll probably annoy some of my relatives in California, but I kinda like sea lions. Um, sea lions, the reason it'll annoy them is that if you kind of live in a beach community, sometimes sea lions just take over plot of land, and it's just there, and, like, they're big, and they're not aggressive so much, but they're just there.
Yeah.
Pier 39 in San Francisco, after an earthquake, the sea lions just kind of took over a part of the pier, and they just colonized it, and it's theirs now. Um, but they're interesting, and I love their family structures. But yeah, it's hard for me to pick.
So do you like more mammals then? Like sea mammals?
I do like mammals. I find sea mammals interesting. I also find fish interesting. I love octopodes, the different species of octopus. Like octopuses are really cool and interesting. And there was one in an aquarium that I would come and visit, and the octopus seemed to recognize me. And like, I don't know if I'm just projecting because I'm like, I like this octopus. He is my friend now. But, he was very good at hiding, and, I would come and, like, stare at the tank for a while, and after a while, like, he would make himself visible while I was there,
Mhm.
and I'm like, "I think that octopus trusts me." So, I think that they are absolutely fascinating animals, and, um, if there are octopus friends listening to this, I did not mean to make you seem less interesting than mammals.
Your octopi have long memories. Um, so I guess looking at your writing more holistically, do you have a favorite thing that you've ever written?
Um It's really hard. There are things that I think like Can't Draw Out the Leviathan is probably my most acclaimed story. It was nominated for awards. It was reprinted in I'm not doing this to show off. I have it as kind of aid memoir because sometimes my memory is terrible. But like it was reprinted in the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, Best of British Fantasy.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know, it's my favorite. Right now, I would say if you forced me at gunpoint to pick, it would be a toss-up between, my story in New Sons, which is Counting Her Petals, which, is very difficult to write, because I actually use, 3 different voices through the story, and basically try to thread three different well, they're not really three different perspectives, two of them are the same, but try to thread three different things into one story. And it it took kind of a long time. It required me to kind of record myself talking out loud because there's a bit of it that is in kind of a storyteller type AAVE that like I needed to make sure the sound of the words were right.
Mm.
Um, and then, between that and actually Femme and Sundance, which I think was regarded as a mostly fun story, but was a really hard story for me to write. Um, and I really think I fired on all cylinders there. It is the story that I am the most proud of, like, accomplishing, of being able to pull off the things I wanted to pull off in. So I guess those would be my two favorite right now until I write new ones.
Mhm. And I'm also like interested about like the behind the scenes process for writing. Is there like a edit that like stands out in your mind as the most difficult edit you've had to make?
um, I like editing.
Oh, wow.
Because for me, editing allows me to fix stuff that I have not gotten right. It allows me to look at stuff that's broken. One of the edits I made in an early version of Canst Thou Draw Out the Leviathan, I think was really important for me to make. The opening scene where the main character gets onto the whaling ship and is looking at his papers of manumission and putting his tools and all in order didn't appear in the first draft. I started the story um, with the ship already at sea, and him already doing his job as a carpenter. Um, because sometimes I just like to get into the story, and sometimes
Mhm.
I'm like, you can figure the stuff as you go along. But it allowed me to put in some real grounding details. Kind of, in particular, there was an underlying theme that, for him as a former enslaved person, the ship which is kind of colonizing the sea and taking these intelligent sea creatures and harming them, also represented freedom. And that is also sort of ironic from somebody whose ancestors were shipped across the ocean in a boat. Was that
Mhm.
this thing was a type of freedom from him? It was a place where he was treated with dignity and, if not equality, at least according to his worth, um, where obviously he wouldn't even as kind of a talented enslaved person. And it was really allowed me to kind of pin those underlying themes directly to the front of the story. So adding that scene on was actually, I think, is one of my most memorable edits because I think it
Mhm.
really kind of clarified what I wanted to do with it and kind of made a wedge for the shape of the whole story. Um,
Mhm.
One of the hardest edits I had to make, Film and Sundance has sort of, I wouldn't say a sequel, but like it's the same characters. It's years later. It's after they're no longer done. And one of the characters in there, I'm non-binary, and one of the characters in the sequel is also non-binary. And I have a scene that deals more directly with their gender. And it's shoplifting scene where Davion is shoplifting fancy clothes because he can't really afford them, and they kind of make him feel, at home in his gender. And his boyfriend comes to go pick him up out of jail, but it didn't really fit the pace of the narrative, and it was already a pretty long story. So when I was reviewing it, I'm like, I will save this scene because I will come back to this and maybe I'll write a whole new story about it, but it can't go in there. And that was
Mhm.
tough because it was the original emotional core of the start of that story. So I think that's my toughest edit.
Mhm. Well, thank you for sharing. I'm all out of questions. Is there anything else you wanted to, I guess, speak on before I kind of start the end of the interview?
Um, Thank you just so much for having me. I'm sorry that I seem a little scattered today. It's been a
Mhm.
really long week, and
I get that.
I was very excited about doing this interview. So thank you so much for having me. Again, I just want to say to people out there who are people of color, people who are black, people who are mixed race, people who are queer, people who are weird, that your stories are also interesting and valuable, and uh, there needs to be more of them. And my hope always when I write something is that somebody who grew up, maybe not just like me, but someone who grew up in circumstances similar to me, who thought they just weren't very interesting or that like they were too weird or nobody would want to read about that, would kind of feel, if not reflected, at least understood and, you know, know that they have worth and value. So I think that is an underscoring of everything I've ever written. Uh, so please, if you are writing and you haven't sent things to other things, keep writing, keep polishing, send stuff out. And I really hope to see more people of color, more queer people, more weird people out in the world doing well.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you so much for joining for the interview. I'm in kind of rusty. I haven't done one, I think, since like October. So
Yeah.
yeah, thanks for coming on the show. Are there any short stories or projects you have coming up we should keep an eye out for?
Uh, I have a novella that is almost finished and a novel that's half finished, but I don't have a publication date for either of those. So once I get my website up and running, which should be the next couple of months, I will put any updates on there. But right now, while Twitter is still sort of hanging on by its fingernails, if you follow me on Twitter, at Seraph76, Sierra Echo Romeo Alpha Papa Hotel 76. Usually anything new, any new projects I have, I will announce there.
Okay, I'll put your Twitter in the description box of the video for people catching the replay.
Okay.
Um,
Thank you so much for having me.
yeah, thanks so much, viewers, for coming out. The ending is going to be a little funky because of the tech issues, but I'm going to disappear off the screen here, and I'm going to try and end the interview on my laptop as well. So goodbye and have a good one,
Bye.
everybody.